you and I have spoken a bunch of times over the past year or so. And so I know that you've had a really fascinating journey of developing not just your product, but also building your company. So I'm wondering if you can, as far back as you'd like to go, because I know you have a fascinating education journey. And I even, when, researching before conversations, I always check guests' social handles. And I saw you had a recent Instagram post that was a look at a very young you, basically, not to embarrass you, but basically rebelling at a preschool or kindergarten graduation.
Oh yeah, I didn't know that was the one that you were going to reference. I thought I posted another one. It was a picture of me as a kid, and I said, when I grow up, I want to work in EdTech, which was like kind of true. But more, I mean, I posted a picture of me when I was 6, but in actuality, I started my interest in EdTech when I was about 11. But yeah, when I was very, very young, I did not like following directions. It was almost like destined for me to drop out, now that I think about it. And it was weird because I was a very smart kid. Like, I would do very well in AP classes that I enjoyed. And then I would go into Algebra 1 and I'd just say, like, no, sorry, I'm not doing that. But yeah, my interest in EdTech started when I was about 11. I remember sometime around when they announced that the Chromebook was coming out. So the first 2 Chromebooks, if I remember correctly, were Acer and Samsung, and they were like $200. And to me, that was like, wait a second. I've had a netbook before, and the experience was horrible. The hardware wasn't very fast, and the only thing I could do was browse the web. But what if I had a laptop where I could only browse the web? And I was like, that's great. And so many apps are going on the internet now. So I could imagine that this was going to change education. And before that, I remember the iPad was also brand new too. So I thought that might have some kind of implications on the way that we look at personal computers and whatnot. But I really saw that the cheap price point and the access, also the fact that cloud storage too. So I remember when I was in middle school, the thing that I always hated and that everybody hated was saving things on the Z drive. And they actually still use those today, which is kind of crazy. But you save things on the Z drive and then you can't get them at home, right? Like, you get them at other computers on the same network at school, but you can't get them at home. So I also saw the Chromebooks as a way for me to be able to do work in school and at home and kind of bridge the gap between the two. And that was my first real interest in education.
Mm-hmm. So I can cut this out if you don't want to emphasize it, but you mentioned a couple times relatively recent events. I think it is commendable the age at which you've founded your company and started your business. So are you open to talking about that and how you kind of went from high school to making a big decision there to entrepreneurship?
Yeah. So after middle school, when I was in high school, I was extremely bored. I was far more interested in learning things outside of school than what I was learning in school. So I remember thinking about the future of work one day, and I said, you know what? I should just drop out. It doesn't make sense for me to be here. My goal wasn't to start a company, and I don't recommend to anybody, like, drop out of high school and start a company. Like, that's a terrible idea. Your life's going to be a lot harder than it needs to be, even if you are successful. And for me, sometimes I still look at it and I'm like, yeah, my life is a lot harder than it really could have been. But, I just knew that school wasn't going to get me where I needed to be. So after dropping out, one day I wanted to understand how I learned as a person. So I decided to take apart all of my Google searches, and I started to see patterns in the way that I was searching. It's like, that's fascinating. And then I started to find that the pattern was specifically strongest when I was working on projects. It's like, interesting. So I interviewed some friends about their Google searches, found the same pattern, and we all had different interests. So I also was very cognizant of that as well. And I found the same pattern, and theirs was also strongest around when they were working on projects. Then I started to research things like learning through projects. Then I found project-based learning. Then I started looking for research papers on project-based learning. Then I started to see that it was like this magical thing that apparently made every single classroom better, but it was also really hard to do. And I was like, interesting. So why was my school not doing this? So Then I started visiting schools that were doing project-based learning. I would basically sign up on the parent tours of these progressive private schools. And I was like 16, 17-ish at the time. And I'd show up there with my little baby face. And then I'd start citing research papers about project-based learning. And they'd just look at me like, what is this? Like, this is either like a sick joke or this kid's just trying to run away from home and enroll himself in our school. So after that, they would invite me back, weirdly enough, because I guess they just like got a kick out of it or something. And then I would basically do product interviews with them and talk about specific things that I saw in their classrooms. And a lot of those conversations became part of our product. And part of the conversations we started to have with public school teachers, we referenced some of the things that we learned in those schools.
Wow. So even though I think you might have mentioned, the Google search process to me before, it's just so fascinating to see that's such a organic way to track somebody's learning process, that we have this record of this external record of our curiosities.
Yeah. And that actually came from one day. So I was always interested in startups before, as I mentioned. So I was always like researching different startup ideas and whatnot. And I just learned, like, I amassed so much knowledge, not a lot of knowledge through it, but just like a lot of the foundation from it. And then I just wanted to learn how I did that one day. And I was partially going just because I wanted to find my previous stuff that I had found. But then as I was searching, I was starting to think about my own thought process. And I was like, what if I turned this thought process into a regular process every day? And that's also something that just drove like me to figure out that process too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that if we're getting into now, maybe some of your curiosity and how that could be translated into a product and a process, I'm imagining that starts with a broad question that ultimately leads to unique skills that one needs to execute on to answer that question. How did you turn your process into a process?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I like to do is I like to hone the way that I look at problems. Right? So I think the best thing that, like a lot of products, the best products, what they do is like the core value is driven down to like, we need to do this like X faster. We need to enable X to be more efficient so that way somebody can produce more revenue with less time. Like there's always this core thing that's an extremely small problem. Like for me, I remember when I first decided that I was going to work in EdTech, my goal was like, the problem we're fixing is the entire education system. And then I was like, well, no, I mean, like one product is not going to solve the entire education system. And that's not even a very good problem statement. But eventually what we discovered was that the problem statement was that assessing projects is time consuming, right? Like I think as granular as you can get to it, and it took us a lot of steps to get there too, because for a while it was, we're going to fix the entirety of education. And then it was like, we're going to fix engagement in education. And then it was, we're going to implement project-based learning. And then after like 50 million different things that we dug in depth from, like, we're going to help implement project-based learning, we found that assessing projects is time consuming, was that one small problem that we could really focus on.